Harry, thank you so much for joining us. We're going to have you sit here. You have so much to share with us. We have just one short hour, and so we'll get right to it if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Harry, your father settled in Berlin in 1919. He married your mother in 1926. By the time you were born in 1937, Hitler and the Nazis had been in power for 4 years. Let's begin first with you telling us a little bit about your parents and their lives prior to your birth, what you've learned about that.
Right. I'll try to remember. My father was a small businessman. He worked in the fur business. And my mother, I think, was a homemaker. Of course, my brother and sister were born before me. There were several other relatives who lived in Berlin. My father's 2 brothers and one of his sisters. And my mother's brother also lived in Berlin. And I think they were very close to each other.
And from the picture we saw with your aunts and uncles, it looked like you did have a large extended family.
Yes.
Both in Berlin and elsewhere.
Right.
Yeah.
The ones in the picture, that was my mother's side of the family. Almost all of them were living in Poland, so I never met them. I never met my grandparents either.
Your father had been a veteran of the First World War, as I understand it. Do you know anything about his service during World War I?
No, he never talked about it. The only thing I know is that he was a teenager when he was in the army. Once, my wife Arlene asked him what it was like, and he just told her it was terrible.
It was terrible. You also shared to me that he either lied about his age to join, or there was misunderstanding, but he was like 15 when he joined the army.
Yes, it was a trick used to try to avoid going into the army. It's not his doing. I think my grandparents, his parents, didn't declare him when he was born, so until 3 years later. And that way, when he was called up to go serve, he would have been he would have been 15. I'm a little confused now, but the idea was that he would be very young and look too young to go in the army, but they took him anyway.
But it didn't work.
It didn't work, right.
Your sister and your brother were born in the late 1920s. Do you know anything about what your parents' life was like in Berlin during that time?
I know only a little bit. They had the middle-class life. They were religious, but not very religious. They went to synagogue on high holidays. I don't think they kept a kosher house. My brother and sister went to school. My sister went to a public school. My brother went to a Jewish boys' school until Jewish kids were no longer allowed to go to public school. Then both of them went to a Jewish school.
Went to the Jewish school. Kristallnacht, what we call the Night of Broken Glass, took place November 9th through 10th, 1938, so the year after you were born. Sometime around Kristallnacht, your family fled Berlin for Belgium, but prior to doing that, your father had taken your brother and sister to Aachen, Germany, but returned from Aachen. Can you tell us about the events that caused him to go to Aachen and come back, and then about your family's flight to Belgium after Kristallnacht?
Right. As you mentioned in the introduction, my father had this friend who was a policeman who told him things were going to get really bad for Jews in Germany and that he should get out. So my parents devised this plan. He took my brother and sister, who were like 8 and 9 years old at the time. He took them to Aachen, which is a spa resort near the border of Holland and Belgium. And he actually didn't tell my brother and sister what the plan was about. He told them they were going on vacation. But they went to Aachen, and the idea was there they would find a smuggler to get them across the border into Belgium. So that's what happened. They hooked up with a smuggler, and there were a lot of other people wanting to leave Germany. So there's a very large group of would-be immigrants. And they went through the woods and got past the German border, and then they ran into a Dutch patrol. The smuggler, who was a German woman, either got lost or they ended up at the Dutch border instead of the Belgian border. And they were turned over to the German authorities. The adults were put in jail. The children were not jailed. Actually, my brother and sister and the other kids in the group were handed over to the Jewish community in Aachen, and then they were placed in different families. Then the police in Aachen called my mother in Berlin and to let her know that her husband was in jail and that she could come and pick up her children. So a couple of days later, actually with my mother, I was with my mother. She couldn't travel, I guess. So her brother, my uncle Abraham, came to pick up my brother and sister and brought them back to Berlin. Then shortly after that, my father went on his own and got into Belgium. I don't know how, but he got in Belgium.
So somehow he was released and...
Oh yeah, he was, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. He was released a week later after the German authorities made sure that he had paid his taxes. There was an exit tax, which was amounted to, I think it was 90% of your assets.
So once he paid that, he was free to go at that point.
Right, he was free. There was no restriction on leaving the country. They wanted to get rid of Jews.
Right.
So then it was a matter of getting across the border into Belgium illegally, but somehow he managed that. And then he arranged for a Belgian who lived near the border, excuse me, in that area of Belgium was, until World War I, was part of Germany.
Okay.
So he was a German-speaking Belgian, and he actually commuted on a regular basis. I think he worked in Germany and lived in Belgium, and crossing the border for him was no problem. He took us, that is my mother, my brother, my sister, and I, took us across the border into Belgium in his car. There was a little incident there.
I want you to share the incident with us.
It's not something that I remember. I was 1 year old.
Right.
We were.
But you're central to the story.
Yes. We got to the border. It happened that just when we got to the border, Hitler was giving a speech over the radio. It was a very important speech because it involved what was going to happen to the part of Czechoslovakia called Sudetenland. Hitler had met with the prime ministers of France and England that day, and Ian was speaking about. And so the driver was called in to go into the custom house. And then he came back. The German guard, there was one German guard outside because the others were inside listening to the speech. He opened the gate, but meantime, while we were waiting, my mother had given me the keys to the car to
keep you occupied, yeah.
Keep me occupied. So the driver came back out in the car, My mother gave him back the keys. There was a whole set of keys, and he was looking for which was the right key. And meanwhile, the German guard got impatient, put down the gate, came over to the car, and until then he had not looked at the car. But now he was this was at nighttime. Yeah. He was flashing. He had his flashlight, and he was lighting up. He looked at each other of us in the car, and meanwhile the driver got the right key. The car started. The guard let us open the gate and let us through.
So you were now into Belgium.
We went to Belgium.
And you went to Antwerp.
Yes.
Yeah. Before we turn to that, what do you know about any efforts your parents had made to try to leave Germany earlier? I think you had shared, and they tried to get a visa to the U.S. at one point.
They applied for a visa to come to the United States, but the number that they got meant that it would have been years before we could come. My father had even arranged, well, he had sent money, I don't know how, but probably illegally, to England, a large sum of money in preparation for that.
In preparation for that. I was also going to ask you, you of course mentioned that this policeman who had been a family friend, if I remember correctly, he was the fiancé of a young woman who had been the family maid at one point, but she had to leave working for you. And why was that?
Young German women were no longer allowed to work for Jewish families.
So that was part of all the restrictions against Jews under Hitler, even before you left Germany.
Right.
You're in Antwerp. Do you know much about how your parents, what their life was like in the beginning while they were in Antwerp, how they were able to sort of get themselves reestablished?
I think that although we were allowed to stay in Belgium, even though we were refugees, there were restrictions on work. I don't think my father was allowed to take a job. Mm-hmm. And so he was dealing in currency. There were many people who wanted to leave Belgium or Europe because of the threat of war, and but they needed currency that was worthy outside of Belgium. So they needed either dollars, American dollars, or the British pound. And my father was in the business of exchanging currencies to make a living.
So they were making ends meet, and you would continue. This was late 1938. And you would continue living in Belgium. And of course, World War II began with Germany invading Poland in September of 1939. But for you, things changed dramatically when Germany invaded Belgium in May of 1940. A few days after the invasion started, your family fled for France. Harry, tell us what you can about your family's attempt to try to make it to France and what happened to you once you reached the border.
Right. As you said, the invasion started May 10. On May 14, which was my brother and sister's birthday, they were born on the same day, a year apart, my family and 4 other families arranged to travel to the French border. And they rented a truck with a driver, and he was supposed to drive us to the French border. But about 2 million Belgian people decided to do the same thing. They wanted
at the same time.
Yes. So there were a couple million people, Belgian refugees, on the road
fleeing for France.
Fleeing for France.
And they were traveling by any means possible, right?
Right. There were some vehicles, but most people were in carts and on bicycles, but most people were walking, carrying whatever the valuables they could. so the roads were extremely crowded. We got to Ostend, which is on the Belgian coast, and the driver of the truck said, "This is as far as I'm going." He didn't want to go any further, either because it was impossible with all the people on the road or whatever. So he dropped everybody off.
So he said, basically, get out. I'm done.
Get out.
Yeah.
And so then...
Do you know if you had any belongings with you?
We had some. I don't know what we had, but they couldn't...
Essentially what you could carry.
Yes. Yeah. There was one of the other families were related to us, and so the two families continued then walking, following the coastal road, which leads to France.
Might jump in here too, Harry, and while you're fleeing with a couple million people, the Germans were strafing with fighter planes coming in and strafing and bombing, and so it was a very scary time.
Right. I don't remember that personally, but yes, that's what was happening.
Yeah.
So we continued all the way to the border, and actually on the way, my father and the cousin, it was a cousin, they bought a surrey, as kind of a bicycle with 3 or 4 wheels, and that you see in some resorts like Virginia Beach. People pedal these around.
On the beach?
Not on the beach.
The streets, yeah.
On the street or on the boardwalk.
Okay, on the boardwalk. Okay.
Right. And so they put the belongings, whatever they had, on top of that. And the other family had my cousin, who was also 3 years old. I was almost 3 years old, both of us. And everybody else pushed and pulled the thing until they got to the border. When we got to the border, the French didn't let us in because we were stateless. We didn't have any nationality. They let the Belgians into France, but they didn't let us in.
And your parents were not Belgians, and they had lost their citizenship in Germany, is that right?
I don't know if they ever had it.
If they even ever had it.
Right.
So they're considered, they have no country.
Right.
Stateless, okay.
So we were there, and I don't know what my parents' plans were, whether they wanted to try again later, but anyway, they moved back from the border a little, and they rented a villa in the first resort this is all resorts on the coast.
Right.
And my father by then had run out of money, and so my parents sub-rented the house, the villa that we were in. My brother told me that there must have been about 50 people staying there at the time.
All probably in the same plight as you.
Right,
yeah.
all refugees who were not allowed to go
not
into
allowed
France.
Into France, okay.
Right. I said that around that time that I have my very first memory in my life. The memories of being next to the road in a ditch. And I know my mother was next to me, and I'm aware of many people in the ditch. And next to me on the road, there's a British officer. After Poland was invaded in September of 1939, England and France declared war on Germany. And nothing much happened, but the British sent 300,000 soldiers over to France. Belgium was neutral. So Belgium didn't want any English troops on its soil because that would have compromised their neutrality. Right. But these troops were put on the French-Belgian border to see what was going to happen. If Germany was going to invade Belgium, then they were going to move into Belgium. And that's what happened May 10th. So he said Germany invaded Belgium and the British troops moved in. So like we saw in the picture earlier, the British soldiers were going one way.
Into this way.
And we were going the other way. Right. So in my memory, I'm lying in the ditch, but the British soldier is right next to me on the road, standing, and he's looking at the sky with binoculars. And I fall asleep. I'm less than 3 years old at the time. Fall asleep. I wake up and he's gone. The officer's gone. So I turn to my mother and ask, and she tells me he's gone, yes. And I know that she's anxious at this point, that something's happened. Of course, I don't understand, but I know that she's uncomfortable.
And that's your first actual memory that you have.
Right.
And of course, not to go into it here, but that's where Dunkirk figures into the history of World War II, with the British trying to rescue as many of their soldiers after being repelled by the Germans at that point. Harry, so you're in this home in La Panne, but very quickly the Germans arrive too, and they occupy the same town. So you now pretty much have to leave and return to Antwerp. Tell us about that.
Right. Well, we had no choice. At that point, there was no point getting into trying to get in France.
Because the Germans are invading France, too.
Yes, France was already invaded.
Yep.
So, and the Belgians had surrendered already.
Okay.
And soon the French would do the same. So the only thing we could do is go back to our apartment in Antwerp. So we started the other way and walking. But on the way, we got picked up by German trucks that were returning empty from the front. And they drove us part of the way, and they also fed us. I mean, these were just soldiers. They didn't care that we were Jewish or anything. They were in a war at that time. So they picked us up, not necessarily out of kindness, but probably to get us off the road.
Because you're clogging the roads.
Right. Because we were not alone, obviously.
Right,
there were lots and lots of people.
So they drove you back to Antwerp?
Right, and there my parents resumed their lives. My father went back to his business. My brother and sister went back to school, and I was at home with my mother.
But what's profoundly different now, of course, the Germans are in control. So the Nazis begin issuing all kinds of edicts against the Jews. What were some of those things that they were prohibiting and requiring of you?
They didn't start right away. It didn't start until October.
Okay.
So there was this period where
life felt sort of normal?
Sort of.
Sort of, yeah.
I mean, under occupation, but nothing about Jews in particular. But then in October they started the edict. The first one, I think, was to require Jews to register as Jews. Everybody in Belgium had to register where they lived. This was before the war. This was a Belgian law. But now the German authorities require Jews to register as Jews, which is actually against the Belgian constitution, but since they were the occupier, they enforced that. Another thing was Jews could not own radios. Another thing was restrictions on employment. Civil servants couldn't be Jews. I mean, the teachers, any kind of government employee could not be Jewish. Doctors could only practice with Jewish patients, same with lawyers, and so on. So, in that respect, other than as far as employment was concerned, didn't affect my father because he was not in one of those categories, but it affected us in many other ways.
It did, and for your father, of course, it wouldn't be long before he was called for forced labor. So what did that mean?
The German authorities set up a Jewish council, which was then, as a way of ruling over the Jewish community, the Germans would just give the orders to the Jewish community, and then the Jewish community, the Jewish council was required to carry out the orders. One of the things that the Germans required was able-bodied men, Jewish men, to go to work for them, ostensibly in factories and so on. They also took Belgians, non-Jewish Belgians, but they were paid. They got paid, and they were like workers.
Right.
But the Jews were
slave laborers.
Slave laborers, and they were sent. Many of them were sent to the northern part of France to build the Atlantic Wall, which consisted of bunkers to prevent the British from landing in Europe again, in France, Belgium. My father was one of those who was called up. He was supposed to report at a train station on a certain day with one suitcase, and the Germans had required the first ones to be first Jewish workers to write back home, telling their families that everything was okay. They were working, but they were lodged and fed, and conditions were good, so that other people who were called up would go. But my father didn't trust them. So instead of reporting for work, we left Antwerp and we moved to Brussels. In Brussels, my parents didn't register us, which was maybe helpful later on.
Because then your presence was unknown at that point
Right.
to the German authorities. And so now you're in Brussels in September, and you stayed there for a while. In September 1942, after you'd been in Brussels, in fact, I think for about 18 months, that's when your parents made the extraordinary decision to put the family into hiding. What can you tell us about what propelled them to make that kind of step? We're now going to go into hiding, and what they did.
Okay. In May of 1942, the German authorities required Jews to wear the yellow star on their outer garments. At first, in Brussels, Liège, cities where Belgium has officially three national languages, French, Flemish, and German. Basically, it's two. The northern part is Flemish, and the southern part is French. Brussels, where we're living then, was French. I should point out that there was more anti-Semitism in the Flemish part of Belgium as opposed to the southern part, on the part of Belgian people. And in the French-speaking part in Brussels, the Brussels people, the authorities in Brussels and in Liège, another city, Liège, it's Liege. The authorities refused to distribute the stars. they resisted for about a month. Then they had to give in. But it gave more Jews the opportunity of finding hiding places.
Okay.
Then initially, the Germans asked the Jewish Council to announce that they would repatriate or deport Jews who were willing, who would volunteer to be deported to another country. They didn't say where. Families would be kept together. There would be work, there would be housing, and so on. It was a deception. But they got about 4,000 people to volunteer. They wanted 10,000. They didn't get 10,000, so they started having roundups. Mm-hmm. That was in August. And they started in Antwerp. They had two or three roundups. They came at night. They had the addresses, and they went to areas that were predominantly Jewish. Mm-hmm. They picked up everybody. In Antwerp, the police collaborated with them. Mm-hmm. They surrounded the whole neighborhoods. They had trucks. They picked everybody up that they could find. Whole families, including old people, babies, sick people. So obviously it was no longer that they were taking people to work. Sick people, old people, and babies can't work.
Right.
So the word got back to Brussels, and my parents took a precaution. Since they came at night, we didn't sleep in our apartment anymore. Even though we were not registered as Jews, it happened that we lived in a Jewish neighborhood.
Right, so if they come through, you're going to get caught there. Yeah.
Right. So I know we split up. I was staying with my uncle Abraham, who was nearby, but not in the predominantly Jewish area. And my parents, I don't know who I was with, who else on my family, but we were with friends or with my uncle Abraham. And so a few days later, I think September 3rd or so, the raid happened in Brussels without the participation of the police. Mm-hmm. That was one difference. And everybody who was there was taken away. We were lucky because we were not there. At that point, we went into hiding. Mm-hmm. My parents arranged with neighbors for my brother, my sister, and I to stay with them. Well, actually, not stay with them. My parents asked them to move. It was an elderly couple. Mm-hmm. They asked them to move to another neighborhood where people wouldn't know them, and we could pass for their grandchildren.
Okay.
So these people agreed. They were paid to do that. Mm-hmm. And so for a short period of time, I don't know, maybe weeks, months, not very long, we stayed with them.
And your three siblings together,
right.
Three of you, yeah.
And my parents moved into an apartment in a building that looked like it was vacant.
Okay.
Then after this short period of time, the family we were with, their name was Koons, C-O-O-N-S. They decided to move back to their old neighborhood because there were all these empty apartments, nice apartments. So they moved back, which is not a good idea. Also, the grandson was living with them.
Their grandson.
Their grandson, mm-hmm. Their real grandson, mm-hmm. Was living with them. And he was like 18 years old. He was unemployed, so he decided to join what was essentially the German army. Before it was a militia that was associated with the fascist party in Belgium. So that was another problem.
So he knows he has 3 Jewish kids living in his grandparents' house.
Right, right. So my parents took us away from there. After that, my sister and I were in the countryside in a children's home. I'm not sure what it was. And we stayed there for a while. And my brother came to visit us, and he realized that there were Jewish grown-ups, adults, living in that house too, and that made it unsafe. As children, we could pass, but adults would have had a more difficult time. Right. So that was unsafe. So we're taken away from there. I should mention that once the Germans started the roundups, there were a dozen or more underground organizations that helped Jews in various ways. Some provided false ID cards, because Jewish ID cards, everybody, I think over 16 and over, had to carry an ID card, and it was stamped Jew.
Right.
So at that point, I'm sorry, I got it.
And so you had to leave this sort of children's home that you were in, and is that when you went to the van der Linden family?
Right.
Yeah.
And again, it was an underground organization
that made the arrangements.
Right. So my sister and I ended up with the van der Lindens. They lived on the edge of Brussels, and across the street there were farms, and we lived in a very nice neighborhood. It was created by the municipality. They built these houses, little houses, row houses. They had a little yard in front and a neat backyard. Very nice. And we stayed with the van der Lindens there. That was a Flemish-speaking part of Belgium, and I didn't speak Flemish. But the van der Lindens spoke French. They sent me to school. It was a Catholic school. The teachers were nuns. Mm-hmm. All the instruction was in Flemish. All the kids spoke Flemish.
You spoke French.
And I spoke French, so I couldn't speak with the kids. The nuns could speak French as well as Flemish, but the instruction was still Flemish. Right. There was a church next door, and during the school time, sometimes we were taken to church. That was my first experience in a church, and was kind of in awe of the rituals and the statues, the windows, all these things. And of course I was quite scared of the statue of Jesus Christ on the cross. That was, I couldn't understand what that was about. After I'd been there, I'd been at the school for a while.
Do you know, was the belief of those that ran the Catholic school that you were a French-speaking Belgian from the southern part of Belgium, or did they know that you were in fact Jewish refugees in hiding?
Mrs. van der Linden took me to the school, and I remember meeting the Mother Superior, and they had a long conversation. I don't know what she told her.
Okay.
Mother Superior was very nice to me. She gave me a pear from the orchard. It seemed huge at the time. It was special because food was scarce during the war. So I remember that. I don't know what she told her. I don't know what. I assume she told her I was Jewish, but that might have been the only person at the school.
Right, because otherwise you're Henri.
Yes, I was Henri. No.
Yeah.
Harry was my given name. It's a German. I mean, it's a German name as well as an Anglo-Saxon name. But in Belgium, Harry, that sounds very strange. It's definitely foreign. So I had to change to Henry.
So you would stay with the van der Lindens for a while in the country, then they moved into the city. Am I correct about that? Tell us why that happened and where you moved.
There was an incident. My brother was also staying in that area where the van der Lindens lived. I didn't know it. Nobody told me because they were afraid I would.
We would talk. Yeah.
I would talk. So but the Gestapo went to the house where my brother was staying. He was there, and there were 2 other Jewish kids hidden there as well. The Gestapo didn't go there for the Jewish kids. They were from the intelligence, Gestapo intelligence. They were actually looking for the son of the family, who was an adult, a young adult. He and some other young Belgians were working in Germany on the railroad yard, and at some point, because they were like regular workers, they got a leave to go home for 5 days, but it took them 3 days to get there because the rail traffic was interrupted by bombings and so on. So they decided, well, it took them 3 days to get there. They were going to spend their time with their families and then return to Germany. So they were late coming back. But in the meantime, the railroad yard where they worked had been bombed by the Allies. So the Gestapo suspected that there was at least a spy, one spy among them, who was informing the Allies about whatever was going on in the railroad yard where they worked. They were all put in jail. And this they only figured out later. The Gestapo came looking for evidence. They were looking for a radio transmitter in the house. They looked behind the pictures and so on. They didn't find anything. When they first walked in, they saw the kids and they knew they would live there. They said, here are the Jewish kids. They spoke to them in German.
This is the Gestapo saying this.
This is a Gestapo, yes. And after a while, they left, but before leaving, they told my brother and the other 2 kids that they'd be back the next day to pick them up. Of course, my brother and the other kids didn't wait around. My brother came. He knew where I was staying with my sister and came and told us that we had to leave because if they're coming back the next day, they might search the neighborhood as well. So we left. So I went and stayed with my parents for a short time in their hiding place. And then my parents arranged with asked the underground organization that hid us to arrange with the van der Lindens to move again to a different neighborhood in Brussels where they would not be known. And so they agreed to do that. My parents paid for the move, but they had to change their way of life. And then I moved with them
into the city.
Into the city.
Harry, our time is starting to get short, and there's a couple things I know I think you'd want to talk about, and I certainly want you to. When you were in hiding in Brussels with the van der Lindens, and your parents were hiding in what appeared to be a vacant house, and there's so much you could tell us about that. Tell us about the time when you encountered your mother on the street.
Yes, the underground didn't tell the parents where they hid the children.
Right.
The children were separated from their parents because it was more dangerous for parents if they had their children with them. Children have special needs and so on. So, the parents ostensibly didn't know where their children were. They were taken all over the country. Somehow my mother knew where I was. So she occasionally, not very often, but occasionally came to visit me. I was her baby, so maybe that's...
Right.
Once I was with the Van der Lindens in Brussels after the move. I was no longer hidden physically. I didn't have to hide.
You were Henri, yeah.
I was Henri van der Linden.
Yeah.
I went to school, I went outside, I played. So the only thing that was hidden was I had a hidden identity. I was
right.
pretending to be Henry van der Linden. So, sorry.
Your mother, you encounter your mother.
Right.
Yeah.
So one day I was playing outside with another little boy. We were on the sidewalk, and we had a ball. So we were throwing the ball back and forth, and then all of a sudden I realized my mother is behind the boy. She's walking in my direction. I'd been given various instructions about how to behave. Mm-hmm. Obviously, I had to say I couldn't tell anybody I was Jewish, but
because you're 6 or so now, 6
I'm
or 7.
Probably 6.
6. Yeah.
Yes. But nobody had told me what to do if I saw my mother on the street.
Right.
So I was thinking, what am I going to do? And so she's getting closer and closer. And eventually she came up to me. She passed right me. She didn't look at me. I didn't look at her. I could have touched her. She was so close. But I realized I was not supposed to recognize her.
Incredible composure, though, under those circumstances. Yep.
Yeah, I think I did my best acting between 5 and 7.
Right. It's incredible. I know we're jumping ahead, but in August or September of 1944, your mother took you out of the Van der Linden home as the Germans were retreating, and it wouldn't be long until you were liberated. Tell us about being with your mother and being liberated, if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm. So one day, my mother showed up at the Van der Lindens, and this was not a visit. She immediately said she came to get me, to take me to my parents' hiding place. I didn't know why. She actually didn't explain. It was very strange that the war wasn't over, but I wasn't going to argue with her. Mm-hmm. So she and I, what I remember is being on a streetcar with her, and I was sitting by the window, and she pointed out to the window and said to me, look. Well, when I say she said to me, she didn't speak French, so she spoke to me in German, but that was a giveaway. I mean, so she's whispering to me.
Whispering to you, yeah.
She says, look out the window. So I look out the window, and there's a little German truck next to the streetcar was stopped at that point. And right next to me, almost, there's this truck, and on top of the truck, there's a German soldier with a machine gun, and he's looking at at the buildings. He keeps looking around like he's scared. It was not a normal behavior for a German soldier. And in front of the truck, there's a horse. The truck is being pulled by a horse. It must have run out of gas or something. And my mother whispers to me, "The Germans are running away. Remember this."
You remember that too. Harry, and once the Allies, I believe the British, had arrived in Brussels, your mother took you to see the incoming Allied troops. Tell us about that when you went to the park.
Right. So before the Allies arrived, we knew that they were getting closer, and in fact, when they got close, we could hear the cannon fire already. And it was British troops that liberated Brussels. They arrived one evening. The next morning, my mother took me. Of course, I'm 7 years old at that time, so there's a lot I don't understand yet. But my mother said, "We're going." It was normally we didn't go out.
Right.
So it said we're going out. We're going to go to. There was a park not far away, and it wasn't clear to me why we were going. But since my mother's going out. I asked why my father's not going out with us, and she tells me he hasn't left the apartment for 2 years, and he hasn't seen people, he hasn't talked with people for that time. He's not ready to face the world at that point. So we go off, and there are lots of people coming out of their houses, and we're all going in the same direction. Along the way, we arrive, and there's a German tank, and the turret is on fire. So obviously, I was very curious, and I stopped. I wanted to see what was going to happen. I wanted to see the soldiers come out of the tank, and what it was, I didn't realize it then. The Belgians. The Belgian resistance at that point was attacking the German army as they were retreating, and they probably threw a Molotov cocktail on top of the tank. But my mother was impatient. She grabbed me by the arm and said, "Come on, let's go." So we continued with all these people, and we arrived at the park, and that was quite a sight. I knew something was big was happening. There was this row of tanks. They were stopped. They had arrived the night before. British tanks this time. And there were a lot of soldiers and a lot of civilians, and everybody was hugging and kissing them and giving them flowers and drinks. My mother and I walked over to a tank. There was one soldier standing on the tank. And we looked up at him, and he looked down at us, smiling, and then he extended his arms. So we couldn't speak with him. We didn't speak the language, but my mother understood. She lifted me up, and he pulled me up. And he held me in his arms. And I looked down at my mother. She said, "Give him a kiss on the cheek." And so I kissed him. We were smiling. Well, he was smiling. And I looked down at my mother, and she was crying. So then I couldn't understand why she was crying, but I was upset. So she said, "It's all right. I'm crying out from joy."
Crying from joy. And of course, this was September 1944. The war itself Belgium is liberated, you're liberated, the war would continue until, in fact, 74 years ago today, yes. May 8th, 1945. We're pretty much at the end of the program. I wish we had 2 or 3 more hours with Harry, because there's lots that he obviously couldn't go into detail about or skipped over, or to tell us from this point forward what happened as they tried to reestablish their lives. And we also don't have time for questions from you in the program, but Harry's going to conclude the program in just a moment. When he finishes, you're going to stay up here on the stage, and so we invite any of you who would like to come up on the stage and ask a question of Harry if you'd like to, or shake his hand, or have a photograph taken with him. So we do welcome that, so please do that. Thanks for being with us. We hope you can come back to another First Person program. All our programs until June 6th will be live streamed, and all of our programs will be on the museum's YouTube page. So one way or the other, we hope that you can take in some other First Person programs. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. So with that, I'm going to turn back to Harry to close today's program.
I'd like to leave you with 2 thoughts. First, my family escaped from Germany by crossing the border into Belgium illegally. We were refugees seeking asylum, and we were allowed to stay. We weren't the only ones. Over 90% of the estimated 60,000 to 70,000 Jews in Belgium at the beginning of the war were refugees or illegal immigrants, mostly from Germany, Austria, and Poland. More than 60% of us survived the Nazi attempt to exterminate us. However, that would not have been possible without the many Belgians, such as the Van der Lindens, who risked their lives and the lives of their families to help us. Second, following the liberation of Belgium, I was reunited with my parents and siblings. I remember my sister, 16 years old at the time, saying to me, "Nothing happened to us. We were not caught, and we didn't starve to death." When I talk with visitors at the museum, I'm often asked by school-aged children, "What was the worst thing that happened to you during the war?" I didn't understand it then, but it's clear now. It was being separated from my parents from the ages of 5 to 7. Children that age expect their parents to protect them, not to give them away to strangers, even nice ones.
Thank you. Thank you, Harry. Thank you all very much.